culture today, there is a strange set of attitudes toward history. On the one hand, there's a highly politicised approach to the past, in which people care passionately about history's symbols and about what they represent. Witness the recent protests about and tearing down of statues across the Western world. And yet we know less than ever about history, and we're losing the ability to grapple with the ethical complexities of the past. A recent conversation I had with one of my undergraduate university students is an interesting point of entry into this. He said, "Why would I study the British Empire? It has nothing to do with my life." Now, not long ago, perhaps only a generation, it would have been obvious that the point of studying history is to understand the history of peoples, empires, countries, and so forth, and then make sense of who I am and how to be a citizen in my society in light of these larger stories. But the premise behind my students' question is that the way we make sense of our world, past, present, and future, is through taking me as the starting point. Why is this? In contemporary Western societies, the central idea of what constitutes human flourishing is self-expression and self-actualization. Our culture's vision of what life is all about can be described as finding your personal happiness through being your true self. The cultural axioms of today, which we see everywhere, from advertising for clothing to private schools, embody this idea that your true potential needs to be unleashed and that this is the key to life. Finding happiness, defined in highly individualistic and consumeristic terms, as personal well-being through self-fulfillment. It's live your best life and you do you. Now, this is actually an anti-historical way of thinking. Gradually, over the past 300 years or so, the idea of liberating the individual from all authorities to pursue our personally defined freedom has become unhinged from any overarching story. This rather rosy conception of humanity emerged from the European Romantic idea that the human being is essentially good and it is society which corrupts, dominates us and puts us in chains. Our valorization of the individual as the ultimate source of moral authority makes it difficult to see what the past might have to teach us. And it leaves us bereft of any sense that there is any larger, transhistorical, indeed transcendent narrative that gives history a purpose and therefore a vision of hope. History, by definition, is associated with external forces and structures of society. And in this worldview, history becomes just another source of oppressive authority. Absent any ultimate purpose to time and any greater story through which to make sense of them, historical ideas, traditions, and institutions are merely understood in terms of our own preferences and tastes. We've largely ceased to think of ourselves as historical beings. In an age underpinned by the idea that life is about self-invention and fulfillment, secular Western culture holds that the past has nothing to teach us. And yet, we have no hope for the future. In short, we have ceased to understand the point of studying history, as it seems irrelevant to our projects of self-actualization and enjoyment of life. This is one of the reasons we are increasingly ignorant about history. For example, my students care passionately about human rights, and yet they know next to nothing about where they actually came from. In other words, their history or what these rights are premised upon. We've detached the individual from any transcendent story that gives an account of the big questions and any grounding for ethical and moral categories. Yet these are precisely the kinds of conceptual tools we need to reason about the past and to have a conversation in which we can genuinely, respectfully disagree. The more that we unhinge the individual from the larger stories that give an account of the big questions, the more we are ill-equipped to grapple with history. We reduce ethical reasoning to emotivism, so we just assert our wills and feelings. We fumble around with crude ideological categories rather than engage in genuine conversation. Because a conversation relies upon a shared set of assumptions about justice and the good, for example, to which we can appeal. This is why it is increasingly difficult to have a civilised debate and disagree with each other in a healthy manner. And so we struggle to deal with the ethical complexity of the past, the fact that profound good and yet also evil have existed in the same historical process, or indeed in the same historical figure. Speaking from experience of lecturing on some of these processes and historical figures, the problems we have in wrestling with the legacy of the British Empire is a key illustration. This polarised situation partly stems from the fact that our culture is impoverished conceptually when it comes to wrestling with issues of power and authority. So, what is the right and the just use of power? And this is because we've actually lost the meta-stories that show us what the use of power and authority ought to look like. So we've detached the individual from any transcendent story about time and any grounding for ethical and moral categories. And yet, these are precisely the kinds of conceptual and ethical tools we need to reason about the past. And so there's a genuine sense of confusion. We're confused about how to make sense of the good and evil in the past and about whether there is any hope for the future. On the one hand, there is a sense that we are utterly superior to the past. Technology is constantly updating and improving, and we also often think that we're morally superior to the past with their backward and narrow-minded views. But at the same time, because our culture has no shared story about where we're heading and no sense that there is a purpose to human history, we're also beset by serious pessimism and dystopianism. This is why we come across people who do not want to bring children into a world of ecological and humanitarian catastrophe. Or the sheer despair and the nihilism that underpins a TV show like the horrifyingly violent Squid Games, where there is nothing but the unleashing of the human will and its unbridled darkness and chaos. These attitudes to time, past and future, are basically incompatible. It's inconsistent to hold, on the one hand, that the past is inferior to us, since we have so much faith in human ability and technology, and yet at the same time be racked with despair about the present and the future. So we're confused, and we have almost completely lost the ability meaningfully to engage with the past. We've lost a shared vision of meaning, goodness, of the virtues. In other words, we have lost the larger story. We have no way of making sense of anything outside this immanent world, anything sacred or transcendent, or indeed any ultimate and objective understanding of good and evil. This confusion leaves us rootless and existentially bored, restless. Perhaps you too are noticing that the mantras of self-empowerment, like live your best life now, seem to leave us more dissatisfied than ever. Moreover, if life is ultimately meaningless, how can I make sense of the fact that I still have this yearning for justice, for truth, beauty, and goodness? So what can we do? We need to re-engage with our history properly, not to take the shortcuts or the dismissive attitudes toward the past that we so easily fall into in our culture. We need to engage with history through the lens of a story that gives us a way of understanding the past, but also gives us a vision of hope. We can only engage properly with the past if we have robust criteria for assessing good and evil, truth and lies, justice and injustice. But from where can we have the intellectual resources to assess these issues? Well, here's a historical example of injustice being critiqued through the lens of a larger story. In the mid-18th century, when the British East India Company was expanding its rule over India, it was becoming clear that they were mistreating the Indian people and that their officials often behaved like arbitrary despots, particularly under the leadership of Warren Hastings, the Governor-General of Bengal. Edmund Burke, the famous Irish statesman, philosopher and political theorist, drafted a series of searing reports on the East India Company's policies and behaviour. In 1773, Edmund Burke led the prosecution in a trial to impeach Hastings in the House of Commons of the British Parliament, to remove him as Governor-General. During the trial, in 1788, Burke gave a famous speech in which he argued that the British were acting hypocritically, articulating notions of universal liberty that they were not applying universally at all. He argued that, in fact, because all people possess natural rights, this principle must extend to the people that the British governed. They must recognise the rights of the colonised as British subjects, also protected by British law. Burke argued that the arbitrary power with which Hastings and the East India Company ruled was, and I quote him here, a thing which neither any man can hold nor any man can give, because there are eternal laws of justice to which we are all subject. He who will substitute their will in the place of it is an enemy of God. So how could Burke critique the East India Company and the Empire's mistreatment of the Indians? He was drawing upon the Christian idea that there exists an objective, natural law that dictates that power is not just subject to the arbitrary will of humans, but rather that all power and all people are subject to pre-existent, universal laws. He argued that there were rights that inhered in the natural order of creation, that belonged to human beings and were universal because all humanity was created in God's image. This is what enabled Burke to critique abuses of power. He held the British in India up to the standards grounded in Christianity. In fact, possibly the earliest unmasking of power and authority was St. Augustine's book, The City of God, written in the 5th century AD. The City of God was actually a critique of the Roman Empire, and the critique was, in essence, that the Roman Empire used power to glorify itself and to dominate others. On what basis could Augustine argue that this was a misuse of power? Augustine drew upon a vision of what power, properly used, ought to look like, that derived from the biblical story embodied in the person of Jesus. Jesus implored his followers that they must not treat power like the Gentile rulers do, who, in Jesus' words, lord it over them. Instead, Jesus says that even he, God incarnate, the ultimate power, came into the world not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. The proper use of power, therefore, is through humility, self-sacrificing service, and the care of the most vulnerable. Now, this might seem unremarkable to us today, but in the ancient world, it was considered utterly ridiculous, and it flew in the face of the beliefs of the existing societies. I would suggest that the intellectual resources that enable us to engage with the complexities of the past, to make sense of both injustice and goodness, are those articulated in Christianity. We can find another helpful example in the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. The abolitionist movement made their arguments by holding up the biblical insistence that all humanity bear the image of God. Christianity explains that all human beings are made in God's image and therefore are inherently precious and of equal value, and yet we are fallen and broken, and so we expect moral failure in human beings. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the author whom the Soviet Union put in a concentration camp, put it, the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every man. The Bible is brutally realistic about humanity in all its depravity, its corruption, its abuses of power, its violence. Just read the Old Testament. And yet there is hope because there is the offer of redemption for humanity. The proper use of power is modelled on Jesus, God himself, the ultimate sovereign, who completely humbled himself in order to serve others. So in short, I believe it is possible to re-engage with history properly through reasoned, thoughtful and informed discussion. This is precisely the kind of discussion which is central to life in a liberal democracy. Moreover, we need to engage with history through the lens of a story that gives us a way of understanding and critiquing injustice, the wrongs of the past, making sense of human failings, and yet also a vision of hope, the good, and human flourishing. These are the intellectual resources that equip us to wrestle with the past. And where does this leave us with yearning for sacredness and transcendence? Well, the Christian story makes time ultimately meaningful. In fact, it tells us that the cosmos is intelligible in the first place. It is not here by random chance, nor are we. Goodness, truth, and beauty are transcendent. They find their ground in God. Being part of the Christian story provides the grounding that is an answer to our rootlessness and hope for the future. Augustine put it like this: "My heart is restless, O Lord, until it finds its rest in you."